Just follow your lead.
So, welcome back to Night Flight, and Jerry Marzinsky is back. He has been a counselor for many, many decades in prisons, in hospitals, and you probably know him. We had several talks about schizophrenia, and today we are going to talk about a very disturbing development in psychiatry, but it ties perfectly into our current situation. So, Jerry, welcome back.
Well, it's good to be back, Judith. This is a real depressing situation because it just fits right in with all this virus hooey that they've come up with. Only this has been going on since before 1910. Psychiatry has taken over the Western medical system totally, and what they're doing is one of the biggest shams ever perpetuated on society. It started off even before 1910 with, when they did the Flexner report. So there was this battle between psychiatry and neurology back in the late 1800s. Psychiatry was like the stepchild of medicine, the stepchild of neurology. So here's neurology and psychiatry battling it out. Psychiatry didn't have anything. They had counseling, they were doing electroshock therapy, they were scrambling people's brains, sticking an ice pick up there and cutting their frontal lobes to calm people down. They really didn't have any cure for any mental illness. And they were basically just trying to keep control in the mental hospitals. And they did that with straitjackets that were invented in France. They'd wrap these guys up like tamales and strap them down. At the time I started at the state hospital back in '75, they were just introducing Thorazine, which is a major tranquilizer. And that's what all these antipsychotic drugs are. They're major tranquilizers. So they would control the psychiatric population by shock treatments, which is that I saw one once, I almost fainted. They're not like they are today. They put these big electrodes on the side of their head. They'd give them a diagnosis and shock their brains.
Yeah, but even today, what they are using is damaging your brain.
Oh, big time. Big time. Neurologists said that even after one shock treatment, they could see the neurological damage. And the antipsychotics that they're using today are some of the most dangerous drugs in medicine. But they don't tell their patients that. They keep it hidden. So, I think it was the late 1800s. Phenothiazines were discovered in a dye lab. I think it was in France, in Europe, where the workers in this dye lab where they dyed clothes were getting looped out. And they saw that this dye in particular was causing that. So they started using it for an anesthetic. They used it for several other things. And then they found out that it calmed down psychiatric patients. So here was this big hoopla between the Freudian analysts and psychiatrists who had found something that actually would sedate a psychiatric population. The analyst, psychoanalysts took a long time. It was very expensive. It didn't work very well. So the psychoanalysts bucked psychiatry using drugs over in Europe. So they came over to the US with these phenothiazines, and they began administering these things to psychiatric populations in the psychiatric hospitals. What they would have to do prior to that was they'd have to wrestle with these guys, and people would get hurt. The attendants would get hurt, the psychiatric patients would get hurt, other patients were being assaulted. So it was like bedlam. It was, these out of control populations that they were trying to keep control over. And they used shock treatments for part of that. And it was the attendants that worked on the wards that usually ran that. And they used it a lot for punishment. This patient's causing all these trouble this week. We think he needs another shock treatment. So the psychiatry would arrange it. And then they'd run, this massive amount of voltage through the person's head. they go into convulsions where they had to fill them full of muscle relaxant so they didn't snap their limbs. They'd strap them down and just electrocute them. And the one I watched, the lady actually turned cyanotic on the grid, on the gurney she was on, and she turned purple. And here's a psychiatrist rattling off to all these students showing off. And I'm like, hey, she's dying. Look, she's cyanotic. And he goes like, as an afterthought, oh. So he gets these shock things, these things you shock the chest with, and he put that on and he gave her another shock and she jumped, and then you could see the colors start returning. And when that electricity was on, I mean, here's this thin lady, just this skinny little wraith of a lady, and she's just struggling against those everything's strapped down. The legs are strapped down, her arms strapped down, the chest is strapped, everything's strapped down, and she's convulsing. I mean, she's like, blah, 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 and then, I asked the psychiatrist prior to him doing that, the horse needle was like this big around and about that long. It was huge. I said, what are you doing that for? What is that for? And it was this milky substance. He said, it's muscle relaxant. I said, well, why? Why so much? That's a horse needle. He said, if we didn't give them that, they would snap their bones during the convulsion. So here's a treatment that snaps bones. So I watched as they did that. They put in this, and she was diagnosed with major depression from the DSM. So she had a diagnosis, and they jammed this horse needle in there, and she just kind of passes out. And then he put these big electrodes on there, about an inch on each side, and he put this gel on there. And I asked him, what's that gel for? Well, if we didn't put the gel on, the electricity would burn her skin. So that's how powerful it was.
Yeah. Okay. So I would like to bring a little bit of structure into this.
Okay.
So for those listeners who are, whose daily bread is not psychiatry, what is the DSM?
The DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It was, started in, I don't know, I got the things here, but what they first put on it was psychosis, schizophrenia, and then they needed something to classify these mental illnesses. So what they've done is they've took pieces of behavior, of human behavior, and they've cut it up into pieces, and they put a diagnosis on it. Okay, every single one of these diagnoses is completely made up. There is not a clinical test. There is not a physical test. There is not any EEG, EKG. There is no test that will physically diagnose any of these diagnoses that they have. There's no substantiation other than what they say it is.
Okay, and how does anything end up in the DSM? Is there a committee? Is it getting voted in?
It's even worse than that. If you go to the American Psychiatric Association site, you can find a form where anybody can recommend a new diagnosis.
Okay.
So they recommend, then they have this form that you have to fill out that, what this new diagnosis is, and you submit it, and then they look it over with their team of so-called experts, psychiatrists, mostly paid off, 75 to 80% paid off by the pharmaceutical industry. And what they do,
I was just going to ask you, because it appears that if it's basically getting voted in, then of course that means the more diseases you have, the more disorders you have, the more money you make.
The more money they make, and the more, so they need that DSM for the insurance companies. All right, they have to have a diagnosis. So they started out with just a few diagnoses. Now they have drummed up 297 or something like that. And you're right. What they do is they, from what I've heard or read, is it's like a tobacco barn. All these highfalutin psychiatrists who are with the system all get together once every few years, and they come up with all these new diagnoses. And some of them are totally ridiculous. I mean, let me read you some of these ridiculous diagnoses that they have passed and put into this manual. Mathematics disorder, right? So if you don't like math, you've got a mathematics disorder.
Yeah,
Caffeine intoxication disorder. If you drink too much coffee, you've got a,
caffeine is a poison. I'm very sorry. I can see that, and caffeine also holds your brain constantly in a fight or flight mode. So
well, it kind of does, but what is psychiatry going to do about it?
Yeah, I know.
Give you a tranquilizer because you drank too much coffee? I mean, there is no cure for any of these diagnoses. None. They have none. All they have is drugs that treat these symptoms. And the more symptoms they can treat, the more money they make. So these diagnoses are 75 to 80% of the people who are on this committee that concoct these diagnoses are under the pay of big pharma. So what happens is, psychiatry, who are the drug pushers for big pharma, make these diagnoses up. And then big pharma comes along behind and makes all these drugs to treat the symptoms. So it's a huge, massive scam. So some of the other diagnoses that they put in there: sibling relational disorder. So if kids are fighting with one another, they got a sibling relational disorder. Sexual orientation disturbance was in the DSM-2. That's homosexuality. They made it a mental illness. There was so much reaction to that they had to vote it out. So they can vote things in, they can vote things out. All of this is completely made up. There is no substantiation, any clinical anything to prove any of these things. And some of them, here's more ridiculous: Florence syndrome. Okay, this is one.
Excuse me, come again. I didn't hear that.
This one's called Florence syndrome. Okay, it's in
Florence?
Florence, like Florence, Italy.
Yeah.
Here's the symptoms: being overwhelmed by beauty, such as in Florence, Italy, fainting at paintings, pictures, getting dizzy, and they treat it with antidepressants. Paris syndrome, mostly Japanese patients visiting France. Symptoms include depression, anxiety, and feelings of persecution. Earlier, it would have been called cultural shock. No, but they made it a disorder, and they treat it with some drug. On top of that, psychiatrists rarely, if you gave 10 psychiatrists a patient that didn't have a very clear cut disorder, and you told them to diagnose whatever was going on, virtually all of them would have a different diagnosis. So there is no validity to this stuff. It's all dreamed up. It's not regulated. There's no scientific backing. There's no test, and then there's no cures for any of these things.
And what I also found out, the current update also includes grief, racism, and childhood disorders. And I mean, excuse me, childhood is not a disorder. Yeah.
Well, according to them, it is. So here's I got this whole list of like 3 pages of all the drug money that's flowing into these things. So the American Psychiatric Association accepted more than 1.7 million in pharmaceutical funding for its annual conference in San Francisco. About 56% of its 12 million a year income comes from drug makers. So I remember when I was working in the state hospital, these drug companies would come in with these massive lunches that everybody wanted to go to because they were free, and they would peddle their drugs in these things. They'd show all these charts and all this fancy looking stuff. And at that time I was trying to figure out what caused schizophrenia and what evidence they had for these drugs. And I asked one of the psychiatrists, I asked a couple of psychiatrists, how do you know you know, how do you know what they're telling you is the truth? And they said, well, they do the research. You know, the pharmaceutical industries do the research and they pass it out to the psychiatrists. And they read this stuff and they believe it. You know, New York Times reported that psychiatrists in Vermont and Minnesota topped the list of doctors receiving pharmaceutical company gifts. And this is financial relationship corresponds to the growing use of atypical antipsychotics in children. So these antipsychotic drugs are some of the most dangerous drugs used in medicine today. And there's over 1 million US children on them right now. These things rot out your peripheral nervous system. They shrink your brain. You know, they cause untold physiological damage to your nervous system. And all this is covered up by the drug companies. Now, matter of fact, it started showing up in the state hospitals where they called it the Thorazine shuffle, where these people couldn't walk with a normal gait. So some researchers did some research on autopsies of long-term mentally ill schizophrenics and found that virtually all their brains were shrunk. And all of them were using these antipsychotic drugs. We're all put on long-term on these antipsychotic drugs. So when they found a one-to-one correlation between long-term use of antipsychotic drugs and the brain being damaged, killed, and shrunk, they published this information. A lot of the journals wouldn't even put it out. All right. The ones that did, it caused a big stir. So the psychiatry and the big pharma jumped in there and go, oh, that's not due to our drugs. That's due to the schizophrenia. It's this, whatever it is in there, it's making them shrink their brains and it's killing their brain. It's not our drugs. You know, so that's not what the autopsy showed. So other researchers got monkeys and they started feeding them antipsychotic drugs, and they found that their brains shrunk also. All right. Mm-hmm. So they covered this up. You know, they wouldn't publish it in the medical journals. They wouldn't. They just suppressed it. You know, mm-hmm. They didn't want people to see it. And even, you know, the entire time I worked, almost 40 years in all these different mental health settings, psychiatrists would never tell the patients about how dangerous these drugs were. At the most, they would say, oh, well, this is going to calm you down. And they are major tranquilizers. Your vision might get a little blurry. Mm-hmm. You know, you might be a little off kilter for 2 weeks until you adjust to it. And then they turn them loose and they'd say, come back in 2 weeks and we'll see how you're doing, see if you need your medicine changed. All right. So what it was like there wasn't any procedure. It was like guesstimation that the psychiatrist would look at what he got, and with his experience of how these different drugs worked, he'd pull one of them out of his bag and say, okay, let's start with this one. You know, and if it didn't work, they'd switch to another one. They'd switch to another one. They'd switch to, and over and over and over.
So just trial and error.
Trial and error, you know, and what they found, the research has found that antidepressants, for the most part, work just barely better than placebos. And in 30% of the cases, the placebo even worked better than the antidepressant drug. You know, so, you know, back in 1910, this all started with the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Group that sponsored the infamous Flexner Report, which shut down any medical school outside of mainstream pharmacology. So they were basically paid off the Congress to push through these laws that saying that if medical schools aren't teaching pharmacology-based treatments, they're scammers. They're worthless. You know, back in 1910, they had you know, Tesla's you know, violet ray technology. They had electrical cures. They had natural, all these different branches of medicine were spreading out. So these big guys, and from what I heard is, you know, they made a lot of these medicines out of oil, you know, hydrocarbons. and
Yeah,
they
the
wanted
Rockefeller Foundation.
the
Yeah,
Rockefeller
they were
Foundation.
very interested. Standard
Yep,
Oil,
yep.
they had a field day. Mm.
Oh, they had a field day. So they actually shut down all these other therapies in the U.S. Called them, for what they call them,
Quackery.
quackery. That's it. That's what I was looking for, quackery. Uh, so, only a few medical schools survived that. And only those could legally license doctors. So they had control of both the Congress of the United States, and they had control of the medical schools. And they had control of the universities. So here they are publishing all this stuff about pharmacology, and everything else was quackery. And that just went
And
on.
that
And
was
on.
practically the beginning of the destruction of holistic medicine.
Yes. Yep. And there's
Remember a couple of years ago when all those holistic doctors died, one
Yep.
after the other?
Yep. Yep. So anything to prove that it worked, they would go after these people. They still don't know how these psychoactive drugs work. They have no idea. When the phenothiazines came out that they started treating schizophrenia with, and that only worked because it's a tranquilizer. It calmed these people down. And that's all it did. It destroyed their brains, it destroyed their peripheral nervous system, but it kept them manageable. They were very toxic drugs. I have a list of the side effects here if you want it. It's like 2 pages long. You want some of those?
Yeah, some, but not the entire 2 pages.
All right, let's see what we got here. What's interesting too is the suicide rate in the United States is going up dramatically too. If these drugs work, the suicide rate wouldn't be going up. All right, A2. All right. Well, here's some comments from patients who use this stuff. They said it's hard to describe the effects of this drug. And
Jerry,
others
you wanted to read the side effects.
Side effects. Okay, you're getting me back on track again here. Okay, side effects: muscle rigidity, brachykinesia, which is significantly slowed movement, dystonia, involuntary muscle movements and contractions, muscle tremor, akinesia, significant restlessness and feeling as if one needs to be in a constant movement or motion, tardive dyskinesia, involuntary movements of the face, especially the mouth, lips, arms, and legs. So you'd see these long-term mental patients at the state hospital. They had something they called tongue darting, where their tongue would go, and it was uncontrolled. It was due to the damage that these antipsychotic drugs were causing on them. Neuroleptic malignant syndrome. This is one of the most dangerous. It's serious, often life-threatening condition that's characterized by muscle rigidity, fever, sweating, irregular heartbeat, blood pressure changes, altered mental status, including confusion and disorientation. All right. So what they came up with, these were the Thorazine and Melrose were pretty rugged drugs. You got hit with those and you were feeling it. So what they did is they came up with a second generation they called atypical antipsychotic drugs that caused the same damage, but the side effects were milder. Okay. And they cause dizziness, weight gain, sexual dysfunction, cardiac effects, hypotension, dry mouth, and constipation. And what they do was when these side effects started showing up, they would douse, back in my day when I was working at the state hospital, they would douse these symptoms down with Klonopin, which masked the symptoms. So it allowed them to keep poisoning the patient and destroying their nervous system without them feeling the effects of that. And they knew what they were doing. They knew.
Oh, lovely.
It wasn't it?
Yeah.
Insomnia, constipation, tremors. It just goes on and on and on and on.
Yeah. So you sent me a video this morning, and of course I watched it, and I remembered it because I have watched it before, and I made some notes here. So we had in 1940 the National Council for Mental Hygiene And a Colonel J.R. Rees, he proposed the following: to bring all spheres of life under the influence of psychiatry. And then he mentioned that education and church is the easiest one to influence, and that law and medicine would be the difficult fields to influence. I cannot quite fathom that, because actually a lot of medicine and law these days, I think, is corrupted as well, at least the institutions.
Well, you're right. You got to keep in mind that was done like 1947. So you could
1940.
yeah, so you could see where they were headed. But right now they have corrupted medicine. You know, matter of fact, I just was reading an article. They said 90% of the people who told their doctors that they were suffering depression or anxiety were offered drugs. Yeah, I think I could safely say you're not going to go into a psychiatrist's office and tell them about anything you have and not come out of there with some kind of drug. So, yeah, these people are the drug pushers for the pharmaceutical industry. You know, they get all these free samples. They're paid off incredible amounts of money. You know, here I have, you know, like 6 pages of these highfalutin people that were paid massive amounts of money by the pharmaceutical industry. Joseph Bilderman, chief of the program in pediatric pharmacology, Massachusetts General Hospital, $1.6 million in consulting fees from Big Pharma. Melissa Del Bello, research psychiatrist, University of Cincinnati, paid between $100,000 to $80,000 in 2003, 2004. Frank Goodman, former National Institute, now these guys are high up, former National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH director. Goodwin earned at least $3 million between 2000 and 2007 for giving marketing lectures to physicians on behalf of drug makers. Charles Numeroff, professor and chairman of psychiatry and behavioral sciences in Emory University in Atlanta, from 2000 to 2006. Numeroff received just over $960,000 from GlaxoSmith, only disclosed $35,000 of it. You know, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. Just professor of psychiatry and human behavior at Brown University, you know, affiliated with, he was a ghostwriter. So what the pharmaceutical industry does is they get these ghostwriters that write things about good things about their drugs. And then they look for people who have done any kind of research that supports that. And then they pay them to come and talk about the wonderful effects of these drugs. Yeah. So they're orchestrating the whole thing. I mean, and this guy was one of those ghostwriter guys. And he published Paxil's use in children. See, Paxil came about in the, what was it, the 70s, and it was Eli Lilly came out with it, and they, out of nowhere, I mean, there was no clinical evidence for this, saying that there was a chemical balance disorder that Paxil fixed temporarily. That was totally made up. They had nothing to substantiate it. They knew it was a lie from the start, and they pushed it. Yeah, so they're going, okay, these drugs must do something chemically. They must do something because some of them work. So they come up with this chemical imbalance theory, and they put millions and millions of dollars behind this bogus theory that there is no proof of. Yeah, they had no evidence for it. Eli Lilly knew that from the start, and they pushed it anyway. Yeah. So then they started pushing all these drugs, saying, you know, antipsychotic drugs, anti-anxiety drugs. I mean, all these drugs for all these diagnoses were due to some chemical imbalance in the patient's brain that these drugs somehow temporarily fixed.
And they do not have a test for that imbalance.
They do not. None exist. Matter of fact, they don't even know what the chemical balance of the brain should be. That's how big of a scam.
So they cannot mention, let's say, yeah, you have your serotonin is too low, or what, they cannot even mention what it is, the chemical imbalance.
No, they're still doing it, but they're still pushing the lie.
But I mean, which chemical it is?
They don't even know. They have no idea.
Okay.
What they're saying is the serotonin was associated with changes in depression. So if you have a depressed nervous system, your serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter, isn't going to be pumping like it normally does. So what these antidepressants do is they block the reuptake and destruction of those neurotransmitters, so they transmit a little faster. It's not an innate chemical imbalance. It's due to being depressed. Your system doesn't work as well when you're depressed. You know, so they make up all, and they're still pushing it. Matter of fact, one of the congressmen, you know, I think what 10 years, 15 years ago said, if there's no evidence for a chemical imbalance, how can you keep pushing it? So the congressman or the senator wrote to the FDA, which is very interesting. They're on the FDA is now located in Baltimore on a medical or a Army facility where they're shoot to kill orders if anybody goes onto that property without permission, which is really odd. Why would they do that? Why would the FDA, who's in charge of pharmaceuticals, be put on a military installation protected by soldiers with shoot to kill orders? I mean, this is crazy.
Yeah, maybe if the unraveling of the narrative continues, then maybe they fear that people will come with the pitchforks and the gun.
I would think so, you know, so it's insane what they're doing.
Yeah.
Where did I leave off?
I also found some other numbers here. When psychiatry started out, I'm talking about the United States now. Mm-hmm. They gave 1 million to psychiatric research. That number has gone up to 1.4 billion per year. So what exactly is psychiatric research? What do I have to imagine there?
Well, what you imagine is any article that anybody publishes that supports psychiatry's use of drugs for their profit. So you got, you know, psychiatry is the drug pushers for the pharmacology companies. You know, they're given free drugs. They're given free food. They're given free lectures. They're paid off. I mean, all these guys here. There's 2 of them here that were. Here they are. You know, these guys were on this DSM committee. So all these, you know, like 6 pages of these guys that were paid hundreds of thousands of dollars were either on these committees or had been on these committees. David Kumpfer, a member of the DSM-4 task force and chair of the DSM-5 task force, which is the newest version coming out, has been a consultant to Eli Lilly and Company, Johnson & Johnson, and also sat on the advisory boards of Forest Labs and Pfizer. In 2008, Kumpfer disclosed that he had been a consultant for Forest Pharmaceuticals, Pfizer, La Roche, and all these other drug companies. You know, here's another one, Dilip Jeste, APA trustee and member of the DSM-5 task force, as a consultant for Bristol Myers Squibb, Lilly, Janssen, and all these other drug companies. Bristol Myers, he received supplemental support to NIMH, which is NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, has also been taken over by the drug companies and is controlled by them. So NIMH grants from AstraZeneca, Bristol Myers, Squibb, Eli Lilly, Janssen, in the form of donated medication for their studies, metabolic effects, and newer antipsychotics in older patients. I mean, so
So did I understand that correctly? Writing an article, or let's say a paper, that is not supporting those drugs, that would not be considered research?
they don't publish it.
Ah,
So,
okay.
so all these mental health journals, all these Department of Psychiatry, if something comes up like that, they won't publish it because it's not funded by the pharmaceutical industry. You know, they get paid a lot of money for publishing these articles. They get paid a lot of money for teaching this stuff. They're making, I forgot how many millions of dollars a year just selling this DSM manual. I mean, it's a big, fat, thick book with all these fabricated mental illnesses in there. They're making millions selling these to universities, to psychiatrists, to psychologists, and psychology is following right up with them. You know, it's like, oh yeah, what they do, and basically because they need those diagnoses to get insurance payments. They have to put a diagnosis down, and the insurance companies will only pay for certain ones. You know, and there was a big battle between psychology and psychiatry. Psychologists wanted to be able to prescribe these drugs also, and psychiatry went nuts and they shut them right down. You know, they would not allow psychologists to prescribe these drugs. And on top of that, it gets even crazier. Um, they won't let. It was strange. It was like the schizophrenic thing where master's level clinicians could not officially use the DSM to diagnose patients that they were seeing. So the psychiatrists wanted control and psychologists wanted control of using those diagnoses. And people with a master's degree weren't considered knowledgeable enough to do that. Yeah.
So they had to have a doctor or what?
Well, that's right. They're saying, well, you have to, but then again, it's like on the front lines, it's not the psychiatrists that are doing all the work. It's the master's people. They're seeing the patients, they're doing the diagnosis, they're making the recommendations, 90% of which is adopted by psychiatrists. They're running around dishing drugs out to everybody. So, you had to use the diagnosis. And then here's this squabble about who's official enough to use these diagnoses that are all made up and fabricated in the first place. It's insane what they're doing. It's just insane.
Yeah.
So here's six, like all these pages here. Look at this. This whole thing is all these high up officials who were taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from drug companies to do their bidding, to publish articles to support their drugs. APA and NIMH, they're all taken over. The government's taken over. They're all paid off by big pharma. And on top of that, if these drugs worked, the suicide rate in the United States is so here's you got modern psychiatry with all these modern drugs that are approved by all these drug manufacturers and touted. In the United States, according to the Center for Disease Control, the suicide rates in the United States have hit the highest level since World War II. Somewhere in the area of 35,000 people kill themselves in the United States every year. And I think the last estimate was closer to 40,000 or so. There were 50,000 killed in the Vietnam War, and these people are killing themselves. From 2000 to 2006, the United States suicide rate has increased 1% a year with all their modern, wonderful drugs. If these drugs were working, why is the suicide rate continually going up?
Yeah, you know what that reminds me of? I just read an article, and that article was so true. Still, up to this day, more people die by unsafe water intake than all the diseases and natural disasters combined. So if our overlords really had the interest of human health and well-being, well, they would have done something about that issue. That so many people die every year because they do not have access to clean water.
Yeah, it seems like if they had our best interest in mind, things like that
Mm.
wouldn't be happening. This bogus virus stuff wouldn't be happening. Um, look at this from 2006 to 2016, there was a 2% increase in the suicide rate in the US with 1.4 million suicide attempts in 2017 and 47,000 deaths. Now, this is modern psychiatry at work. These are helping people, right? And most all of them were on some kind of drug, you bet. There is no policy, there's no manpower institution or anything to address this institution and the problems that they're having. I mean, they're out of control. They were advertising Prozac as a mood brightener for a while. As a cosmetic pharmacology, they called it.
Yeah, when I remember that was late 80s. Is that correct? If memory serves here. And I remember that there was a huge hype as if, they had found the Holy Grail.
Yeah. And that, one of the side effects listed on the Prozac bottles is suicidal ideation. So it increases suicidal ideation. I mean, it's like, it's crazy, and they don't want a cure for any of these. None of these drugs they put out cure anything, nothing. All they do is they treat symptoms. So what they want is just constant treatment of symptoms, and not curing anything. Matter of fact, here's an interesting article where what they did is the NIMH got accused of not spending enough money on research for schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what they did is they reduced overnight, they reduced the adult population of schizophrenics in the United States. So it says, the wondrous rays of Washington, in a single day, the federal government officially reduced the number of people with schizophrenia in the United States from 2.8 million to 750,000. With a change of the National Institute of Mental Health's website in 2017, 2 million people with schizophrenia simply disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't counting the schizophrenics in jails and prisons. They weren't counting the schizophrenics in group homes being treated, and so it's like 2.8 million estimate, or 1.1% of the adult population, had been the official standard in the US since the 1980s, when the last major prevalence survey was carried out. The figure was provided to Congress in 1933 and used for national estimates, such as the cost of schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
NIMH director Joshua Gordon wrote in the Psychiatric Times that the 1.1% figure is no longer scientifically defensible. So you're talking about what these people are doing here. So he said, in view of the most recent findings as of 2001 to 2003, the National Comorbidity Survey, which included only those who lived in symptoms of schizophrenia who lived at home. None of these other institutions, not prisons, not psych hospitals. It included those hospitals, nursing homes, excluded hospitals, nursing homes, group homes, jails, prisons, homeless shelters, and people on the streets. Thrown out. They didn't even take those into account.
Mm-hmm.
In short, the 750,000 estimate, or 0.3% of the adult population, was an absurd undercount, obvious to anybody with anything. So, what they did is they reduced the number of schizophrenics. So in 2016, it looked like NIMH spent 2,054 million on schizophrenia research, with 2.8 million people affected, and that was 90.71 per patient. When they got rid of all these schizophrenics, NIMH then could publish that they were spending 173 per patient. So it was all a manipulation of the numbers to make it look like schizophrenia wasn't a problem. the World Health Organization says it's one of the top 10 disabilities on the planet, you know, and these people with their drugs are making it worse because when you start relying on drugs to cope, your coping mechanisms start tanking, so that they're weakening the population as well as poisoning them.
And so there was another gentleman, sorry, my co-host. There was another gentleman, and he said something very disturbing, that the eradication of all concepts of right and wrong must be eradicated, and that is the goal of all therapy. So, and we are seeing this today because a lot of people actually think that right and wrong, that we just make it up as we go. Yeah, they actually think that there is no objective morality. And yeah, and most people act like it if you look closer. So the confusion, the inability to distinguish right from wrong, and he said it blatantly, that is the goal. So in other words, you want total confusion.
Well, they're doing a pretty good job of it. You know, it's like somebody does something to get themselves in trouble and they feel depressed and they can't shake it. They go to the psychiatrist and get some drug to drug it. You know.
Yeah, and I mean that meme has been, yeah, the New Age, for instance, has supported that meme. There is no right and wrong and no good and evil. It's all an experience. Yeah, tell that to the little child that is being tortured to death in a satanic ritual. Tell that to the child. It's just an experience. There's no evil here.
or a child who's being pumped senseless with antipsychotic drugs because he's a little bit too active. You know, over 1 million kids right now are on antipsychotic drugs in the U.S. and it's some of the most dangerous drugs used in medicine. Now, one thing that goes along with what you said is in psychology, in social work, and in psychiatry, there is no mention of the spirit. It doesn't exist. We are spiritual beings. You know, we have a spiritual core. This is a spacesuit. They completely ignore the human being as a spiritual entity, you know, a combination of physical and spiritual, but your life comes from your spirit. You know, that's what animates this. And your spirit goes, this falls apart and rots. You know, and all their therapies up to this point are just not effective. You know, these drugs that psychiatry is dishing out, they're like band-aids, expensive, dangerous band-aids. Traditional psychotherapy works very poorly because it doesn't take into account the spiritual nature of man. And what's very interesting is just within the last 10, 15 years or so, a ship captain. Now, this is a guy who drives big ships, cargo ships across the ocean and had done so for 3 decades, had plenty of time to read and think. He was brilliant. It's a guy called John Maish, came up with the idea that we are energetic beings, you know, and that the mind isn't what psychiatry and psychology and social work say it is. The function of the mind is done by the soul, from what they're teaching. He says the mind itself, all it does is take pictures of where you focus your attention.
Yeah.
It's the spirit that does the processing. It's a spirit that does the thinking. It's a spirit. So what happens is in a trauma, that gets, your attention gets frozen down to yourself. Okay. And you blame yourself or look toward yourself. What did I do to cause this? What did I do why did this happen? And you come up with reasons, you know, while you're in a state of shock or trauma. And those stick, you know, things that happen in trauma, you remember those, and then they get suppressed, and they cause a reaction every time they're triggered over and over. So Maish has come up with a way to get in there, go and empty that energy ridge, and it causes a very quick and very dramatic recovery with that particular ridge that's gone. You know? And I've been using this with my schizophrenic patients, and a number of them, after we cleared this out, the voices were gone.
Yeah.
So this works, but they won't support it. They took it, and they have it in Australia. They took it to the universities, and the universities want nothing to do with it. Psychiatry wants nothing to do with it. They won't promote it. They won't put it out. You know, they're suppressing it because it does work.
Yeah. So another very disturbing comment here from another gentleman. I do not have his name present. It doesn't really matter. He's long gone. But here is how blatant he was. He said that to achieve world government, it is necessary to remove from the minds of men the following: individualism, loyalty to family traditions, national patriotism, and religious dogma. Yeah, okay, religious dogma, I would be on board, yeah. But yeah, national patriotism, you know, it can go haywire. Yes, it can go in a very, very bad direction. But in general, I would say, as most things in life, this is a question of balance. Yeah. Of course, you know, if you go overboard, then before you know it, you go from patriotism to despotism, yeah, against people that you do not like for whatever reason. May that be skin color or whatever, yeah. So, but in general, I have to say here, no, to eradicate loyalty to family traditions. Yeah, okay. Most marriages are failing these days. We have a lot of single parent households. Yeah. And individualism. Yeah, okay. That is pretty obvious that there is a huge push towards a hive mind, a single-minded opinion. Yeah. And it became very, very obvious the last 2 days, years. Sorry.
Well, that plus, you look what psychiatry is doing. They're drugging down the entire population. They're making up a disorder for every single human condition. You know, grief, it doesn't matter what it is. They're going to have a diagnosis for it that they can drug you for. So you get a divorce, run to the psychiatrist and get an antidepressant. You know, you're a little bit too anxious, go get some Valium, which is addictive.
Yeah. But I mean, who would have thought that even psychiatrists talk about to achieve world government? Yeah, I mean, what is this obsession?
They want control. They want control. You know, they are some of the most controlling people. I don't know if you've ever worked around these people. I mean, they are like the masters of mental health. You don't cross one of those guys or you're in trouble. You know, even if
you know what I found, that and that does not only go for psychiatrists, but during my lifetime, I met a couple of doctors, okay, privately, and not in terms of dates, but you know, you just meet people, yeah, you get to know them. So and I have to say, most of them didn't have the healthiest lifestyle. That was pretty obvious.
Well, here's some interesting thing with psychiatry. The suicide rate for schizophrenics, which is one of the most serious of the mental disorders, you know, that just loss of touch with reality, they say. Their suicide rate is 3 to 5% higher than the average population. And guess what the suicide rate for psychiatrists is?
Higher.
It's So it's the exact same.
Mm.
So the psychiatrists are killing themselves at the same rate as the most disturbed of psychiatric patients,
Yeah.
which is very interesting.
Okay.
And also psychiatrists are attacked at a rate much higher than any other doctors by their patients.
I can't see why.
Yeah, can't understand it.
Yeah, well, but yeah, so I had a couple of interviews, and one of the topics in it was black magic. And I have to say, I see the same traits here again. So in general, how black magic works in a nutshell, it's not primarily about harming others. The primary goal is to sell you a fake reality, a narrative that you have to buy into. And then you, because you believe it, you start acting on it. And in that process, yes, you might harm others, you might harm yourself, but you have become a dark agent yourself. And that is the primary goal. And I see the same traits here in psychiatry, that we make up a narrative, we sell this fake narrative to you, plus we have the pills that go along with it.
Yeah,
and
the pills
then
and the
you buy
advertising.
yeah, you buy into the story, you become the dark agent and start harming yourself or others. Mhm.
That pretty much hits it right on the head. You know, and it's all chemicals, it's all physical. You know, again, not paying any attention to the spirit at all, or the thought. You know, every behavior before it consummates comes as a thought first, and then it goes out. The closest they've ever come is they diagnosed, or they said schizophrenia was a thought disorder. That's it. That's it. They didn't go any further because thought is a energetic entity, just like the voices schizophrenics here are energetic entities. They are not physical entities. You know, nobody's ever found a thought in anybody's brain. It's like opening up a radio and looking for the guy who's singing. You know, it's just not there. You know, they don't ask the question of where thoughts come from, because that's too difficult to answer. They don't answer the question of what is a thought, that it is an energetic entity. It is a form of energy. You know, they don't even look there. You know, so
and it is so strange that they do not notice it, because you know, when they measure brain activity, and let's say they do a test, they show you a series of different photos, some disturbing, some that are calming, soothing, whatever. And then they measure what part of the brain lights up or not. So they actually know that there is energetically, that there is energy, that there is something going on, and yet they ignore that.
yeah, that's electrical energy. It's different from thought energy. You know, even from the time we're born, we're told that all our thoughts are our own. You know, that they belong to you. And then you have a disturbing thought and you go, oh, I must be a horrible person. You know, why am I thinking these things? You know, they don't bring up the fact that who's the one listening to those thoughts? And where do those thoughts come from? It's like this movie playing. You are the one who's listening to those thoughts. You know, they're not coming from you. You're listening to them. You're watching them. You're seeing the images. They're not you.
Yeah.
And they're not taking that into account, that these frozen causes them. This is John Maish who came up with this, and he didn't have anything to do with psychology. He had no training in psychology whatsoever. He was just basically a genius. So he didn't have to wade through all the crap that I'd been programmed with through 8 years of psychology and counseling and PhD program to see this is fault, this is fault, this is fault, this is false. He just wasn't bothered with that from the start. So he sees thought as an energy, and it's like magnetism is an energy. Thought is an energy. Electricity is an energy. Pouring antipsychotic drugs on top of an energetic entity is like pouring antipsychotic drugs on a magnetic field. It doesn't do anything except gum up the magnet. So, you know, what the brain is it's like the CPU on a
computer.
It's like a radio. You know, it's a radio receiver. It receives these thoughts from different places, from different people, from different things. But if you take the radio apart, you're not going to see the person in there. You know, and one of the researches they did with schizophrenia is they did hook up a electrical thing, and they were measuring the voices, and they found that there was a split second between the time that the electrical signal started and the voice appeared.
Yeah.
You know, so these things are coming through, triggering electrical signals.
Okay. So before we close this hour, I just wanted to briefly mention there is a Dr. Doris Rapp, and she has a different suggestion. She is working in the field of allergies. And she said that if you have really as a parent, if you really have the impression that your child is suffering from fatigue or overactivity and things like that, before you start drugging your child, she suggested to rule out other factors. And she knows from experience that certain allergies can result in very complicated and difficult behavior. So, and she said what parents should look out for is too much sugar, fast food, lack of nutritional values, vitamin and mineral deficiencies, food colorings and preservatives, hypothyroidism, allergies, temporal lobe seizures, and pesticides. So, and she said a lot of that difficult behavior can be solved if parents eradicate this. Yeah, the bad food, too much sugar, and so on and so on. And if that after a while doesn't, because okay, all those things, if you eradicate them, they do not work like a nuclear bomb. Yeah, it's not like you drop it today and tomorrow you're fine. It takes a while, yeah, until your body has built up enough minerals, vitamins, and whatever is needed. But I was thinking, so imagine a child with too much sugar, lack of nutritional value, and allergies. And on top of that,
you know what? They'd go to a psychiatrist and they'd be put on Ritalin for ADHD because their sugar, they're flying all over the place with sugar. Yeah, so that's one of the things psychiatry, especially in private practice. When I was working in the emergency rooms of the hospitals, we did not even see a psych patient unless he was medically cleared, unless he was seen by a doctor, and they said there was no physical anything that they could find.
Yeah.
You know, but in private psychiatry offices, you know, a lot of times they don't do that. You know, the guys complain, oh, you know, this kid's eating 20 candy bars a day and he's bouncing off the walls. Yeah. Yeah, they take some of this Ritalin. So, you know, and it's one of the things I saw in the prison too, is, you know, all these prisoners started off on, they were diagnosed ADHD. They were put on Ritalin and Adderall, which are amphetamines. And they felt the best they've ever felt for a while, but they kept increasing it until they went to meth, and then they lost it. You know, so here's all these people that started off doing fine, but they just kept increasing the drug until it became abusive, and then they became psychotic.
Okay, So that was a great first hour, Jerry. And in the second hour, I would like to dive into what is especially disturbing in the latest update, how they might be implementing it in the current situation, and a little more deep diving into the children's situation. So that was the public hour, and we will see the patrons on the other side. Bye-bye.